Mark Reno is the one who said it out loud. He looked at Ernie Irvan's helmet after they pulled him out of the car at Michigan International Speedway, and there was a dent in it, an inch and 3/4 deep, gouged right into the shell by the roll bar. Reno described it the way anybody who'd seen it would describe it. It looked like somebody took a pipe and hit him with it. This is Friday morning, August 20th, 1999, Busch Series practice, turn 4. The car had gotten loose coming off, and Ernie had hit the wall flat on the driver's side, hard enough to put the roll bar into his helmet. Now, if you've been around this sport long enough, you already know about Ernie Irvan in Michigan. Most of you will remember exactly where you were in August of 1994, when the news came out of practice that the kid from Salinas was on life support in Ann Arbor, with a 10% chance to make it through the night. You remember him coming back in the eye patch at North Wilkesboro. You remember him winning at Michigan in 1997. That's the story most people know, the comeback story. What you may not have noticed at the time, and I'm guessing almost nobody put it together on the day, is that second wreck happened exactly 5 years to the day after the first one. Same track, same month, same date, August 20, 1994, August 20, 1999, like the calendar was keeping score. And the story that sits in the space between those two dates and the 25 years since, that's the story nobody has ever fully told, because Ernie Irvan has never really told it himself. To understand what was taken at Michigan, you have to remember what was there before it. In the summer of 1994, Ernie Irvan was the hottest driver in Winston Cup racing. You don't need me to tell you that, but the numbers are worth sitting with for a second. Through 20 races, he was second in the points, 27 behind Earnhardt. 3 wins, 5 poles, 13 top fives. He'd led more miles than any other driver in the series that year, and he'd done it after coming into the Robert Yates number 28 Texaco Havoline Ford the previous fall, as the replacement for Davey Allison, who died in the helicopter crash at Talladega that July. Think about the position Yates was in. He'd buried his driver, handed the car to Irvan, and within a year, Irvan had him fighting Earnhardt for a championship. Doug Yates said it plain years later. It was just instant success, instant speed, and a perfect driver for the 28 car. They couldn't have asked for anybody better to succeed Davey. Irvan had a reputation coming up through the sport. Swerve and Irvan. Aggressive, elbows out. Made some enemies early. By the Yates years, that reputation had mellowed into something else, one of the elite drivers in the garage, and the one everybody knew was going to win on any given Sunday. The crew chief was Larry McReynolds. The wife was Kim Irvan, a UNC Charlotte psychology graduate. They'd been married since November of 1992. There was a little girl, Jordan, just over a year old at the time. He had the car, the team, the wife, the baby, the points lead within reach. If you'd drawn up the life of a Cup driver in the summer of 1994, Ernie Irvan was living it. And all around him, the sport was about to run out of luck. February of that same year, at Daytona practice, Neil Bonnet hit the wall and died. 4 days later, Rodney Orr hit the wall and died. Same injury both times, a basilar skull fracture. The break at the base of the skull where the brainstem meets the spine. In a high-speed impact, the body stops, but the head keeps going, and the soft tissue at the base of the skull isn't built to hold a 10-pound helmet in place at 170 miles an hour. The head tears away from the neck from the inside. That's what basilar means. Nobody was wearing a HANS device in 1994. The product existed. Dr. Robert Hubbard had developed it at Michigan State a decade earlier, but virtually no driver in NASCAR used it. Earnhardt called it that damn noose. The walls were bare concrete. The seats were aluminum. There was no traveling medical team. You relied on whoever the local track happened to have on hand. That's the world Ernie Irvan drove into Michigan International Speedway on the morning of Saturday, August 20, 1994.
The first Cup practice session went green around 8:40 in the morning. Clear sky, low 70s, a little haze over the infield. Irvan was on the 11th lap of a planned 20-lap run. The car was tight, pushing up toward the wall and the corners, and he'd radioed that back to Larry McReynolds, who told him to come in and they'd work on it. Ernie told Larry to let him make a couple more. In his own words, years later, Larry said, "Man, we definitely need to work on this thing, so come in and we'll work on it." I told him, "Let me make a couple more." Well, I went into turn one, blew the tire out, and hit the fence. The tire was the right front. NASCAR's investigation later concluded he'd run over debris and cut it down. Ted Musgrave was running about 10 car lengths behind him and saw the whole thing, said the right front just dipped like he'd cut a tire. Ernie locked it up. The car turned slightly to the left, but with the right front gone, there was nothing there, and it just went dead straight into the concrete. It's somewhere around 170 miles an hour, right front corner first. Then the car rolled up on its left side and slid about 150 feet along the wall before it came to rest. Bill Engel, Ricky Rudd's crew chief, was watching from the top of his hauler. Engel said it looked like Ernie meant to drive right into the wall. Larry McReynolds never saw the impact. He was on the radio telling Ernie there was a caution out at the flag stand, not knowing yet that the caution was for him. Somebody in the pits told him. He commandeered the pace car to get to the scene. Here is where the story turns on a coincidence nobody could have planned for. Dr. John Mino was the medical director of the emergency department at Foote Hospital in Jackson, Michigan. He was also the county medical examiner, and on the morning of August 20th, 1994, he happened to be volunteering with a local rescue squad that was stationed in the infield near the turn where Ernie crashed. He wasn't there because NASCAR had a protocol for it. He was there because that's the kind of guy he was, a trauma doctor who spent his weekends with the rescue squad. It took 8 minutes to cut Ernie out of the car. They got him on a backboard on the track surface, and 6 doctors went to work in teams of 2, 2 on his head, 2 on his left side, 2 on his right, calling out injuries as they found them. What they found was that Ernie was drowning. Both lungs had collapsed on impact, and his brain wasn't getting oxygen. Mino made the call to do an emergency tracheotomy right there on the asphalt, a half-inch incision below Ernie's Adam's apple, a tube, a bag to force air in. The tracheotomy kit was missing its blade, so Mino used a pocket knife. He had only performed the procedure twice in 11 years. Then he made the other call that saved Ernie's life. Instead of taking him to the infield care center the way every protocol said, Mino had the helicopter brought directly to the track surface. 23 minutes from crash to liftoff. Every one of those minutes mattered. Mino said later he was initially pessimistic. He said it clinically the way doctors do. He'd seen people come into his emergency department with this kind of presentation, and the prognosis wasn't good. What he meant was, this man is going to die. Ernie said it a little more directly years later. "Who would have ever thought," he said, "that there was a trauma doctor in the corner where I crashed, and he saved my life." The helicopter took him to St. Joseph Mercy Hospital in Ypsilanti, about 50 miles away on the eastern side of the Ann Arbor metro area. The trauma surgeon who took the call was Dr. Errol Erlandson, a vascular surgeon working with his partner, Dr. Walter Whitehouse. By the time they got Ernie onto a table, the list of things wrong with him read like a teaching case of how a human being dies. A basilar skull fracture, the same injury that had killed Bonnet and Orr in February, and the same injury that would kill Dale Earnhardt 7 years later. Severe traumatic brain injury with swelling extending into the brainstem. Cerebral contusions, areas of bleeding inside the skull. Both lungs collapsed with severe pulmonary contusions. Cranial nerve damage from the skull fracture had knocked out 4 of the 5 muscles controlling his left eye. Somebody at the hospital later described his skull as cracked like an eggshell. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Dr. Erlandson came out and gave a press conference. He said Ernie had received severe injuries to 2 major organ systems, either one of which by itself could be fatal. He said Ernie was not alert. He said a full team was working on him, neurosurgery, pulmonary, intracranial pressure monitoring. And when a reporter asked him point blank what Ernie's chances of surviving were, Erlandson said, "In this business, I believe the prognosis cannot be stated." That's what he said on camera. What he said privately that night to Kim Irvan in the hallway was a number, 10%. Kim told the story herself to Sports Illustrated about 10 weeks later. The doctors came out and told her he had a 10% chance to live, and it floored her, and she was begging and pleading with God. A friend named Mark Reno went to the hospital to see him. He counted 21 tubes running into Ernie's body. Robert Yates was told by one of the emergency workers at the track that Ernie hadn't made it. That turned out to be wrong, but Yates carried it for a while. Dale Earnhardt and Mark Martin drove to Ann Arbor to see him. Ernie was on a ventilator, unresponsive, with Vaseline smeared over his eyes so they wouldn't dry out under the fluorescent lights. When Dale and Mark started talking to him, his hands started moving toward their voices. The doctors kept giving Kim the worst-case version, and at one point Kim stopped the doctor in the hallway and told him never to say something like that again. She was afraid if Ernie heard it enough, he'd give up. Ernie said later, "She was so strong in helping me get better." He stayed deep in the coma for about 3 days. Then there were signs. A left leg pedaling a bicycle in response to voices. His intracranial pressure started to come down. By day 8, they moved him from critical to serious. By about 2 weeks in, they had him off the ventilator and sitting up in a chair, mouthing words. He was still in and out of consciousness for most of that time. His first real memory of being awake came about 20 days after the crash. He said it the same way in several interviews over the years. He remembered waking up, wondering where he was, and the television in the room was on, and he was watching another driver in his 28 car. It turned out to be Kenny Wallace. He couldn't talk yet, so he used hand gestures, and Kim explained what had happened. Think about that for a second. The last thing he remembered was getting ready for practice at Michigan. The next thing he remembered was watching another driver in his car on television and having to be told by his wife what had happened to him.
They transferred him to the Charlotte Institute of Rehabilitation about 5 weeks after the crash, and they released him at 6 weeks. By October, he was walking into Charlotte Motor Speedway to talk to the fans. By December, he walked onto the stage at the NASCAR awards banquet at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, and everybody in the room knew what that meant. And here is a line from that fall that I want you to hold on to, because it's the only medical assessment about Ernie's cognition that was ever made public, and it was made very early. Dr. James McDevitt at the Charlotte Rehab Facility told Sports Illustrated in October that Ernie appeared largely to have escaped the cognitive, emotional, and fatigue problems so often associated with a neurological injury this severe. McDevitt said he'd seen very few patients recover this well from injuries that bad. That statement was made 10 weeks after the crash. It has never been publicly updated. Not once in 30 years. I want you to remember that. The left eye was the thing everybody could see. 4 of the 5 muscles that moved it were damaged. For the first 3 months, it didn't move at all. Ernie had to wear an eye patch, sometimes over the good eye to force the bad one to work. He had double vision, no depth perception. Ernie himself said later that the doctors never thought the eye would move again. In December of 1994, less than 4 months after the crash, Ernie got in a stock Ford Thunderbird on a road course in Florida and ran it, a 250-horsepower street car. Ford engineers were there, and Dan Estes told reporters afterward that if Ernie had lost anything behind the wheel, it didn't show up in the test. In March of 1995, he tested a real Cup car at Darlington. That summer, he tested in the Truck Series and in Cup cars, and in September, Robert Yates walked into the NASCAR trailer and vouched for him personally. Ernie told the story himself in 2022. He said NASCAR took Robert Yates's word that he was able to drive a race car again, and Robert had a lot of credibility. And Robert said, "He's good." That was the whole medical clearance process. There was no protocol, there was no standardized test. Robert Yates said he was good, and NASCAR said, "Okay." October 1st, 1995, Tyson Holly Farms 400, North Wilkesboro Speedway, 13 months and 12 days after the crash. Dale Jarrett was driving the 28 for the rest of the 1995 season, so Yates entered a second car, the number 88, same Texaco Haviline colors. Ernie put the eye patch on underneath his helmet and went out and qualified 7th. On lap 47, he was running 3rd. On lap 125, he took the lead. He held it for 31 laps. He finished 6th on the lead lap. Mark Martin won the race. Ricky Rudd in the week before the race told a reporter there was probably not a guy in the garage who wasn't pulling for Ernie to make it work. I believe that. I was watching it on television, and I wasn't exactly a Yates fan, and I was pulling for him. Afterward, Ernie said they'd answered a lot of questions that day. He said he'd had a ball the whole time. He said with about 5 laps to go, the emotions finally got him. Years later, looking back, he said North Wilkesboro was probably the best race he ever had. Not because it was his best finish, it wasn't, because he'd gotten back to doing what he loved. For 1996, Yates kept both drivers. He put Jarrett in the new '88 car with Larry McReynolds and gave Ernie back his '28. In July, at the Jiffy Lube 300 at New Hampshire, Ernie won his first Cup race since the comeback, 19 races back in. McReynolds was across the wall on Jarrett's car that day, but he told Ernie to do the Polish victory lap, clockwise, the wrong way around the track, the way Alan Kulwicki used to do it and the way Davey Allison never got to. Ernie said in Victory Lane it was amazing they'd made it back. In September, he won at Richmond, holding off Jeff Gordon by about a tenth of a second. And then the one that mattered. June 15, 1997, Father's Day weekend, Miller 400 at Michigan. Started 20th, took the lead for the first time on lap 162, led 33 laps, won by just under 3 seconds over Bill Elliott. Michigan, turn 2, 34 months after the crash. Ernie told CBS in Victory Lane that about 10 laps to go, he started to get tears in his eyes and said, "Only in America, you know what I mean?" Later, he said he remembered going through that corner on the last laps, thinking, "Man, I've got to get through the corner, because that was the corner I crashed in," and everything went smooth. Doug Yates said later that the Michigan win in '97 closed the chapter on everything that happened that day. Kyle Petty said he remembered watching it and thinking, "God, he is fast." That was the last time Ernie Irvan won a Cup race.
Here's the part that doesn't usually make the highlight reels. Within about a month of the Michigan win, Robert Yates announced he wasn't renewing Ernie's contract for 1998. The reasons weren't on the racetrack. The reasons were that Ernie had become difficult with the sponsors. He'd shown up an hour late to a Texaco gala looking sullen. There was an altercation at a bar near Charlotte. He was, in the words of one of the reporters covering the beat, behaving in ways that had cost him the goodwill of the team and the sponsors. Yates himself said, in announcing the decision, that he hadn't come to it overnight. He'd worried and wrestled with it for more than a year. It wasn't a simple one-answer deal. And he said attempting to explain it would take longer than it took to make the decision itself, and if you hadn't lived it, you still wouldn't understand. The Greensboro News and Record put it a little less diplomatically. They wrote that you couldn't argue with Ernie Irvan, the racing driver. He'd driven 79 races for Robert Yates Racing and won 8 of them, but something dark had happened on Ernie's way back. Something dark. Nobody in racing media in 1997 asked what that something dark might actually be. Nobody connected it to the brain injury. This is a man who 3 years earlier had spent 20 days in and out of a coma before he could ask his wife what had happened to him, whose own doctor had admitted at the 10-week mark that severe TBI patients usually have cognitive and emotional and fatigue problems, and who had then been declared a miraculous exception and never reevaluated. The documented behavioral changes after severe TBI include impulsivity, irritability, emotional lability, impaired judgment, and difficulty with social and professional relationships. Nobody in 1997 said any of that out loud. They said Ernie was being difficult. They said Yates had lost patience. They said the PR was bad. And they moved him along. He went to MB2 Motorsports for 1998 in the number 36 Skittles Pontiac. The results tell you everything you need to know about what was happening. In 1994, running 20 of 31 races before the crash, he'd led more miles than anybody. In 1996, back at full strength in the 28, he'd led in 15 of 31 events. In 1998, at MB2, he had no wins and no top 5 finishes, best of 6th. In 1999, through 21 races, he led a grand total of 9 laps. 9 in 21 races. The Ernie Irvan who'd been chasing Earnhardt for the championship was gone. What was left was a guy hanging on, running mid-pack at a team that was over its head, still pushing a race car on talent alone because that was the only thing he knew how to do. He told the story himself in his last major interview in 2022. He said by 1999, he would tell himself, "I swear I can hold this thing wide open." And he tried to. And he said, "I busted my butt." He said it in his own words, "I was never happy. I was on the pole, and instead of being happy, I wanted to go faster." That's the man who got in the Busch car on Michigan on the morning of August 20th, 1999.
It was Friday morning practice for the Napa 200. Ernie was driving his own number 84 Federated Auto Parts Pontiac for Irvan SEMO Racing, a Busch car he was running out of his own operation. Coming off turn 4, he got the car sideways and hit the wall flat on the driver's side. Rescue crews cut the roof off. He was unconscious when they got him out. By the time they had him in the infield care center, he'd started responding, talking to the doctors, moving his arms and legs. Tommy Cameron, the track spokesman, told the media he was alert and oriented. And then Mark Reno saw the helmet. The roll bar had hit the shell of the helmet hard enough to put a dent in it 1 3/4 inches deep. Reno said it looked like someone had taken a pipe to it. They airlifted Ernie to St. Joseph Mercy Hospital in Ypsilanti, the same hospital, 5 years to the day later. Mild head injury, bruised lung, admitted in fair condition. There was something almost absurd about it. The calendar, the track, the hospital. Jay Fry, the CEO at NB2, said it was scary, and that any time something like this happened, it made you stop and think. That was the understatement of the decade. 2 weeks later, on September 3, 1999, at Darlington Raceway during Southern 500 weekend, Ernie Irvan walked into a press conference with Kim beside him, and their daughter Jordan and their son Jared, who was a year and a half old at the time, and Ernie retired from racing. I want to give you his words from that day because they are more honest than anything anybody else ever said about him. He said the doctors hadn't told him he had to retire. He'd made the decision on his own. He said they hadn't told him he wouldn't survive another crash, but that he'd been lucky to do what he'd been able to do. He said the doctors had told him that another accident like the one he'd had earlier would probably be detrimental to him living a wholesome life. Those were his words, detrimental to him living a wholesome life. He said it was something that brought tears to his eyes to know he was never going to drive a Winston Cup car again. He said, normally I have something up my sleeve, but today I don't. I'm retiring. And then he said one more thing, and this is the sentence that is the whole story if you're listening for it. He said, I think some people are surprised that I'm still able to comprehend all this, so I think retiring now is the smartest thing I can do. I think some people are surprised that I'm still able to comprehend all this. That is a man telling you, as plainly as he knows how, that he knows what has happened to his brain, and that he knows it could get worse. That sentence passed through the press coverage in 1999 the way a stone drops into a pond. One ripple and then nothing. Nobody followed up on it. Nobody asked what he meant. Nobody asked his doctors what had been explained to him. It got filed under Brave Driver Retires, and everybody moved on. Kim said it a different way that afternoon. She said he was like a cat with 9 lives. And then she started crying, and she said, he's used up 8 of those.
The epilogue to all this is short because there isn't much of one that's been made public. About 6 months after he retired, an electrical fire broke out in the Irvan family home on Lake Norman while they were on vacation in the Bahamas. Every trophy he'd ever won burned. 15 cup victories, 22 poles, all of it, ashes. Bill France Jr. ordered duplicate trophies to be made and gave them back to Ernie at Daytona. In 2004, he and Kim founded the Race to Safety Foundation, working with the Brain Injury Association of America. They donated bicycle helmets to boys and girls clubs. They organized a walk at Michigan International Speedway called LAPS, Leadership and Awareness to Promote Safety, and drivers came out for it, Mark Martin and Bobby Labonte and Jerry Nadeau among them. The foundation was most active from about 2004 to 2010, and there hasn't been much public activity since. The family moved to Ocala, Florida. As of his last major interview in 2022, Ernie was building and turning wrenches on his son Jared's late model car, and he said it was just the two of them, and they took care of the car themselves. He said Jared was a better race car driver than he was. Said it because Jared thinks the whole time. Kim and their daughter Jordan were doing equestrian. Ernie said in that same interview that life is good. He was named one of NASCAR's 75 greatest drivers in 2023. He has never been nominated for the Hall of Fame. He said once that to make the Hall of Fame would be unbelievable, and left it there. And here's what's never happened. In the 25 years since Ernie Irvan retired, he has never, not once in any interview, any podcast, any book, any sit-down, publicly discussed ongoing cognitive problems, memory issues, processing difficulties, chronic fatigue, depression, personality changes, and long-term neurological care. The one medical assessment that said he'd escaped those problems was made 10 weeks after the crash. It's the only one on the public record. Modern traumatic brain injury science is pretty clear about what happens to brains like Ernie's. Memory gets worse, processing slows, executive function suffers. Depression shows up in 25 to 50% of severe TBI survivors. Personality changes, irritability, impulsivity, emotional volatility are common. Dementia risk goes up by more than 4 times. These effects often emerge months or years after the initial injury, not at the 10-week mark when everybody's celebrating the miracle. Ernie survived the exact injury that killed Dale Earnhardt. He came back from it. He won at the place that nearly killed him. And then he quietly told a room full of reporters at Darlington that some people were surprised he could still comprehend all of it, and nobody asked him what he meant, and he has not been directly asked since. Whether that silence is genuine good fortune, or denial, or the private choice of a man who nearly died twice and doesn't feel like telling strangers about the inside of his own head, or the cultural conditioning of a NASCAR generation that said you tough it out and you don't complain. Whether it's one of those things or all of them, the silence itself is the part of the story nobody has ever told.
Mark Reno said the helmet looked like somebody took a pipe to it. That was the injury you could see, 1 3/4 inches of carved-out phone and fiberglass sitting on a shop table somewhere after they got Ernie to the hospital for the second time. Physical evidence, something you could photograph. The other injury, the one from 5 years earlier to the day, the one that put him in a coma for 20 days and took 4 of 5 muscles in his left eye and cost him the Yates ride and the championship years he should have had, and whatever else it cost him that he has kept to himself. That one you can't photograph. That one lives inside a man in Ocala who tells interviewers that life is good, and who builds race cars with his son on weekends, and who said in 1999, with his wife and his kids in the room, that some people were surprised he could still comprehend what had happened to him. Ernie Irvan walked away from the injury that killed Neil Bonnet and Rodney Orr and Adam Petty and Kenny Irwin and Tony Roper and Dale Earnhardt and Blaze Alexander. Every one of those men went to the same basilar skull fracture. He came out the other side of it. He won races again. He raised 2 kids. He lived. And the part he didn't tell us about because in his world, in his generation, in the seat of a race car built in 1994, that is what you do. You take the hit. You come back. You win the one at Michigan that closes the chapter. And the rest of it is yours to carry, and you don't put it down in public, and you don't ask anybody else to carry it for you. That's who Ernie Irvan was. That's who he still is. The dent in the helmet was the one nobody had to ask about. It's the other one, the one nobody asked him about at all, that this story is really about.